Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into one of the oldest, most profound philosophical puzzles out there. If God already knows everything, why in the world does he need to test us? If you've ever gone through a really dark time and confided in a friend, I can almost guarantee you've heard some version of a very specific, totally well-meaning phrase.
Yeah, that classic line, everything happens for a reason. And usually, right on the heels of that comes the idea that this hardship is just a test. Whether it's grief, illness, losing a job, these brutal moments are so often framed as a test from above. Now, our source material points out that on the surface, this feels incredibly comforting, right? It hands you a concrete reason for your pain. But, well, that comfort tends to crack the absolute second you ask the one unresolvable question about this whole theology.
Seriously, a test for someone who already knows exactly how it ends? This right here is a central paradox we're unpacking today. We're looking at the objective, head-on collision between the claim that life is a test and the defining trait of an all-knowing deity. The source script basically asks us to take this life is a test theory and run it full speed into a brick wall, that wall being God's own nature, knowing absolutely everything, all at once, before it even happens. So to really get this, we've got to look at the baseline claim. Omniscience isn't just about being, really smart or having a great algorithm to predict the future. In Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, the textbook definition of God is being entirely, completely all-knowing. Past, present, future. It is all already seen and settled. Done. This means the deity already knows the exact outcome of your choice before you even form the thought to make it. And our source makes it super clear. This isn't some fringe idea invented to poke holes in religion. This is the established core definition of the deity. Okay, so stack right on top of that omniscience the second major claim. Life is a test. And the author of our source text notes this is absolutely not a straw man argument. It's baked straight into the foundational scriptures. Just look at this passage from the Quran, which explicitly states believers will certainly be tested with fear, famine, and loss. And this idea completely spans across traditions. Over in the Bible, the book of James explicitly tells Christians to frame their trials as a test of faith. So testing isn't just a minor footnote somewhere, it is literally presented as a foundational explanation for why life looks the way it does across the major world religions. This matters because we're dealing with a deeply ingrained universal human framework for processing hardship, not just some niche philosophical debate. So here is the crux of it. Think about how this divine test compares to a regular, everyday test. When a human teacher gives you a math exam, the whole point is to discover if you actually know the material. That uncertainty, finding out what the teacher doesn't know about your brain, that's the entire purpose of a human exam. But contrast that with a divine exam. You've got a deity who, by definition, has zero uncertainty. According to the theology, God already knows exactly who passes and who fails before a single person is even born. So we hit a dead stop. Tested for what? Seriously, what is actually being discovered by a being who literally wrote the answer key before handing out the test? The source argues that, for God, there is absolutely nothing left to learn. That uncertainty that makes a test, it simply does not exist. Now, naturally, theologians and philosophers have spent centuries trying to untangle this exact paradox. The source material outlines three of the absolute biggest philosophical counterarguments used to resolve this clash. We've got soul-making, the free will defense, and skeptical theism. Let's break these down and see how they actually attempt to explain why an all-knowing being would give a test. First up is soul-making, which is a concept often tied to the philosopher John Hick. The argument here goes that the test isn't for God to learn something, it's actually for our benefit. The idea is that suffering builds character, it builds virtue. Kind of like how a muscle only gets stronger when you tear it down first at the gym. It's a really powerful thought, but the source points out a major logical catch. This argument quietly drops the original claim. By saying it's for muscle building, you're no longer claiming it's a test in any real sense, because you're admitting the outcome was never in question. Instead, what the soul-making argument is actually doing is trying to justify why an all-powerful being would choose pain as the delivery method for that growth. Think about it. If a being is truly all-powerful and all-knowing, they have unlimited ways to build a soul. So, as the source text highlights, saying, "I had to let this tragedy happen so your soul could grow," doesn't explain a necessary test. It actually frames suffering as a completely voluntary choice made by a being who had infinite other options. Then we've got the free will defense. This one argues that moral evil exists because God values genuine, free, moral choice way more than just forced, robotic obedience. And you usually hear this one paired right alongside soul-making. Now, in the abstract, this is a pretty sturdy philosophical stance, but the source material challenges us to step out of the abstract classroom right now, because the abstract is the only place these arguments actually survive. The source shifts focus here and asks us to pull this test framework out of the clouds and apply it to the visceral, concrete reality of extreme human suffering. If everything that happens to us is part of this grand test, then that has to include the absolute worst things human beings do to one another. The script uses the heartbreaking example of a 3-year-old child being severely abused. The theology doesn't get a pass here. It has to account for this reality too. So who exactly is being tested in that horrific scenario? It certainly can't be testing the 3-year-old's faith. She doesn't even have a theology yet. But if you argue that it's testing the abuser's free will, so his choices count morally, the source points out a truly terrifying implication. That framing quietly moves the justification completely away from the victim, turning an innocent child into nothing more than raw material for someone else's moral exam. As the author argues, the word test loses absolutely all meaning when you apply it to an all-knowing being who had the power to stop this, knew it was going to happen, and just let it happen anyway. And look, this objection isn't just some modern internet hot take. The legendary novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky put a version of this exact argument into the mouth of his character Ivan Karamazov well over a century ago. Ivan basically declared that he wanted absolutely no part of a truth or a perfect harmony if it was built on the foundation of even one innocent child's suffering. The source points out that this is one of the oldest, most respected philosophical challenges to religious explanations of suffering, and it is still a massive hurdle today. What makes this so incredibly difficult to wave away is the sheer scale. We aren't talking about one tragic outlier case picked just to win a philosophical debate. Extreme, innocent suffering happens constantly, at scale, every single day, all over the world. The source argues that any explanation for suffering has to hold up right here, at this massive global scale. If the test explanation only works for the tidy, easy examples, like a stubbed toe or a rough breakup, then it isn't a complete explanation. It's really just a filter for what people are comfortable thinking about out loud. So, when the test framework finally runs out of road, the source notes that people usually reach for the absolute last line of defense. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy calls this skeptical theism. Basically, this is the retreat into unknowable mystery. It's the idea that we just cannot possibly know God's reasons because his ways and his comprehension are so vastly higher than ours. And hey, on the surface, that sounds incredibly humble and spiritually grounded, right? But let's look at what the source says is actually happening philosophically here. It is a massive concession. You simply cannot have total confidence in one breath, claiming definitively that it's a test, and then in the very next breath, claim it's an unknowable mystery the exact second the logic falls apart. As this explainer text argues, you just don't get to have it both ways. If you genuinely do not know why an all-knowing being would need to test people, then you don't actually know it's a test. Ultimately, the source concludes that relying on the word test is very often just a way of relabeling the deeply uncomfortable reality of I don't know with a word that feels safer and more comforting. The author suggests we reach for this idea of a divine test because the alternative is a whole lot harder to sit with. The alternative is the worldview that this is just how an indifferent universe works, and it is entirely up to us human beings to roll up our sleeves and fix what we can of it. Which brings us right back to our final lingering question. The very next time you hear someone frame suffering as a divine test, the source challenges you to ask this one simple follow-up. Tested for what, exactly, by a being who already possesses the answer key? It is a wild paradox that strikes right at the core of how we understand suffering, omniscience, and the entire universe. So, what do you think about this philosophical clash? Tell me where you land in the comments. I literally read all of them. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the source material, be sure to subscribe for more explainers. Thanks so much for learning with me today.